Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Gardener, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling. It's July 23rd. Today, we remember a gardener who became a saint, and we'll learn about the woman remembered forever in the name of one of the world's most popular hostas. We'll celebrate the Scottish botanist who was the first to describe the prairie buttercup. And we'll also hear some wonderful words about simply being in the garden. We grow that garden library today with a book about gardening and friendship and a heartwarming book from 2015. And then we'll wrap things up with a wonderful pesto recipe. But first, let's catch up on some greetings from gardeners from around the world and today's curated news. So yesterday, I started taking you through all of the different projects that members in the Facebook group for the show were sharing. And it was all in response to the question, what is the biggest project that you have to tackle in your garden this year? Now, Sue Weber and Patricia Chandler Newport are in great shape because they got their projects done. Sue said, "We just finished the biggest project we'd been putting off for years. We had a large area of ditch lilies that were overgrown with creeping Charlie, and they weren't blooming much." She said, "I've been digging them out little by little. And yesterday, we tackled the remaining area, dug out the ditch lilies, and then replanted with hostas, sedum, vinca, salvia, Asiatic lilies, goat's beard, iris, lady's mantle, overdam feather reed grass, daylilies, and poppies. The one large area is now 3 smaller beds with pathways in between. Doesn't that sound scrumptious? I bet it's beautiful." Now, I had the good fortune to meet Sue because I put out a plea on Nextdoor for rhubarb. And Sue volunteered. She's like, "Come on over. I've got some rhubarb for you." And Sue has a beautiful property. So, Sue, if you're listening, I just might have to come over and check out your big project. It sounds divine. Then Patricia Chandler Newport said she already tackled her big project as well. She said, "I raised the entire backyard 4 inches, laid a flagstone path, removed grass from the vegetable garden paths, and put in pea gravel, and now attempting to get grass to grow in 95-degree heat, which is no small task." And if you get a chance to see pictures that Patricia has shared of her garden, of her backyard, it is just something else. I think it's really a gold standard. Just very thoughtfully done, and Patricia utilized every inch of space. Now, listener Leo Presnell has a greenhouse that he's working on. That's always a delightful project. And I shared with Leo that he might enjoy listening to a couple of interviews I did with Shane Smith. Shane wrote one of the very first books on greenhouse gardening. He's a wonderful expert, and you can hear my in-depth interview with Shane. It's in 2 parts over at the Still Growing podcast. Shane's interviews were episode 506 and 507. And again, they're with Shane Smith. Listener Avery Demick said she's redoing her raspberry patch with supports. And I wrote back and said, "Now that's hard work." And then she replied, "I'm definitely calling in the cavalry for this one." You know, raspberries are a lot of work, and your yearly pruning helps make sure that you get a bountiful crop the next year. And if you've never grown raspberries before, the most important thing to know about them is that every single raspberry cane is a biennial. It dies at the end of its 2nd year. So the oldest any of your raspberry canes are is 2 years. They can't get any older than that. Now, this time of year, when your midsummer raspberry crop is done producing, you want to completely cut back all the way to the ground any of the canes that gave you fruit. because that's it. The show's over. That was their second year. Those canes were the 2-year-olds. They're the ones that produced the fruit, and they gotta go. And remember what I said earlier in the month. A flower or a fruit is usually a signal to us as gardeners that it's just about time to act. When the flower is done, when the fruiting is done, the onus shifts to us as gardeners. And raspberries are a perfect example of this. So if you have raspberries and you go in right now after those canes have stopped producing, after you've harvested that midsummer crop on those 2-year-old canes, the next thing you want to do is cut them down to the ground. And that's going to make room for the young canes to come up. In fact, that pruning sends a signal to the plant that it better get going. It better produce another batch of canes. And raspberries do this pretty quickly. In some instances, you'll actually get berries on those new canes later this very same year. It just depends on the type of raspberry you're growing. So, when Avery says that she is redoing her raspberry patch, that is usually a big job. Raspberries can get out of control very quickly. And the reason you want to put in some supports is that it will help guide their growth. Now, in the event that you've inherited a raspberry patch and you have no idea where to start, the first thing to do is just go in and start removing all of the dead canes. It's cleanup time. Anything that looks healthy can stay, but it's really important to get the old canes out. And then once you do that, you should really do what Avery's doing and consider putting in some supports. So Avery's got her work cut out for her, but I have to say I love raspberries. And back in the day when we used to just walk into a grocery store and go down the produce aisle and see raspberries for $4, $5, or $6 for that tiny little package, well, that makes growing raspberries worth it. That and having a bowl of freshly picked raspberries with some cream in the morning for breakfast, that's pretty spectacular. So anyway, Avery, good luck taming those raspberries. I know you can do it. And then finally, Rita Garrettson sent a note, and she said that she's revamping all of her beds. She's adding black soil with aged manure. She's editing her flowers, which can be a very, very challenging thing for us to do. And then she just said, redesign, looking great. Well, I remember a few years ago when I had Heidi Highland come over, and she helped me redesign some of the beds in the front of the house. Now, she brought in a crew of 4 or 5 people, and in the span of about 2 hours, I watched them dig up about 200 different plants from my front beds. And the thinking here was that it was way better to start with a clean slate. Now, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a little startling to see everything coming out of the garden. But all those plants got put on a tarp, and then that entire mound was covered with soil. It was a layer of protection for those plants until it was time to put them back in their new homes. And you know what? It worked like a charm. So ever since then, when it's time for me to redesign a bed, I just grab the shovel and start digging. Everything comes out, and then it gets replaced. And boy, have I gotten a lot less intimidated about moving things in the past couple of years. Really, ever since that redesign. So redesigns are a good thing. And you know, another thing that is very helpful if you're going through some kind of edit is a temporary bed or a working bed. This is just a place to put the orphans, a place to put the plants where you're just not quite sure where they should go. And sometimes the season gets away from us, and all of our good intentions to get everything homed and established, well, we just run out of time. So those temporary beds come in very, very handy. Now, some years, I don't even put the plants in the ground. All I do is leave them in the pots, but then I grab some bags of mulch and I mulch around those pots so that when winter sets in, they're protected. But then in the spring, when I'm full of energy and full of ideas, it's the perfect time to go back to those pots, fetch them out of the mulch, and find a home for them in the garden. So there you go. Just some things to consider if you, like Rita, are thinking about editing or revamping any of your garden beds. And then last but not least, before we head into today's curated article, I wanted to share that I put a very cool link in the Facebook group for the show. It's called Sounds of the Forest, and it allows you to explore the first ever forest sound map of the world. Now, even the way I'm describing it cannot do it justice, but essentially all you do is click on the link and then you can hear what the forest sounds like in that part of the world. Now, when you first click on the link, it says, "We are collecting the sounds of woodlands and forests from all around the world, creating a growing sound map that's bringing together the tones and textures from the world's woodlands." How cool is that? Now, this is an open source library, and it's to be used by anyone so that you can listen to it and you can also create from it. So I have my phone with me, and I thought I would just play for you a sample or two so that you can get a feel for it. But it really is neat. Okay, here's an example of the sounds of a woodland in Finland. That's pretty cool. All right, now let's travel over to Italy. Let's see what's going on there. One moment. Little quieter goings on in the woods in Italy. Here's one from Montreal. Ooh, and here's one from New Zealand. So anyway, there you go. Now you can check this out for yourself just by searching for the word forest, and this post will pop up. It'll give you the link, and then you can have fun just exploring the world and exploring the different sounds of the forest from the far corners of the globe. I thought it'd be a fun activity if you have kids or grandchildren. I think they'd really get a kick out of it. Now, if you'd like to participate in the Gardener Greetings segment of the show, just go ahead and send me your garden pictures, stories, birthday wishes, and so forth to my email at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. That's jennifer@thedailygardener.org. And you can also share in the Facebook group for the show. So keep it in mind, there are a lot of different ways to get your garden or your thoughts on the podcast. Here's today's curated news. Well, I have 2 new blog posts to share with you. One of them is a humorous look at the garden hose, and it's by Carol over at May Dreams Gardens. The post is called My Relationship with My Garden Hose, and Carol writes, "In the spring, we optimistically buy that big, heavy hose that's guaranteed to last a lifetime and never kink. And when we see that hose all wrapped up on the store shelf, we believe those claims. Then we get it home and discover what bad manners it has. Kink? Of course. It will kink the minute you look at it and even think about watering. Heavy? So heavy you can barely stand the thought of pulling it around the garden to water." And then Carol goes on from there. Anyway, I loved this lighthearted post. It's so relatable. In fact, a lot of what Carol writes about gardening is lighthearted and relatable, which is why I especially enjoy reading almost everything that she does. Now, if you'd like to read Carol's post in depth, and I think you will, and you'll probably want to share it with a few garden friends, just search for the word hose in the Facebook group for the show, and Carol's post will pop up. Now, the other post that I wanted to share with you today is from the blog Gardening with Grace. Grace is a blogger out of Western Oregon. And the post that I wanted to share with you was one of her plant spotlights. It was her plant of the week, and it featured Mukdenia rossii crimson fans. And Mukdenia is really an interesting plant. Grace writes, "In 2007, I bought Mukdenia rossii crimson fans after somewhere seeing, I forget now, photos of the pretty leaves. It grew. It's an easy plant with no fussy requirements at all except moist soil. But wait, eventually, if the conditions are right, the green leaves develop a pretty crimson margin, thus the name Crimson Fans. And yes, Grace is a fan of the Crimson Fans." Now, Grace cautions that where things get tricky is the part where it says, if the conditions are right. Grace notes, too much sun and the leaves will burn by turning brown. Not enough sun and the leaves will stay green. So for Grace, the challenge has been finding just the right balance between sun and shade. And Grace writes that she's had this plant both in the ground and in a pot. Now, when I go out to the Missouri Botanical Garden website and I look up Mukdenia rossii crimson fans, it says it grows in zones 4 to 8 and that it's best grown in moist, fertile, well-drained soils in part shade. Now, for me, when I grow Mukdenia back home in Maple Grove, I have it toward the edge of a tree canopy. It's under my locust, but it's out toward the edge, so it does get part sun, and it's thriving there. Well, I should say 2 of the 3 plants that I put there are thriving there. I'll never forget the summer that I planted it about 2 years ago. I needed to head to the store, and my husband was mowing the lawn, and when I came back, I noticed that one of my Mukdenia plants was gone, in addition to one of my Jacob ladders. And I didn't have to ask. I knew what happened. He had pulled them because he thought they were weeds. Now, since that day, I had every intention of splitting my Mukdenia in order to replace the one that was lost. But of course, that has yet to happen. But in my garden of possibilities, it's still not too late. So who knows? That just may happen this fall. In any case, the key for me to growing Mukdenia was the location. I knew I had the right soil. I knew that that area was moist, but it also had great drainage. But after living there almost 20 years, I really know the way the sun works on my property. And it hits the edge of the plants that are right under the canopy there. And I think my Mukdenia like that dappled shade. They're not out in the blazing sun during the hottest part of the day, but they're definitely fully exposed when it comes time for supper or for the sunset. And here's something else to consider. When I'm looking at the Missouri Botanical Garden website here, it says that Mukdenia rossii is native to rocky slopes and ravines in China, Manchuria, and Korea. So sometimes when I struggle to grow something, it's very helpful to understand how this plant grows in its native place, in its home. So I hear rocky slopes and ravines, and I'm definitely thinking good drainage, and I'm also thinking part shade. So keep it all in mind if you decide you want to grow Mukdenia rossii crimson fans. Now, if you'd like to read Grace's post for yourself, there are beautiful images here, and even if you don't want to read that much about Mukdenia, you should really check out Grace's website because she does a very nice job. She's got a lovely blog, and you could subscribe to it and get all of her blog posts. So again, her website is called Gardening with Grace, but you can find it easily just by going to the Facebook group for the show and typing in the word fans. And Grace's post on Crimson Fans, Mukdenia rossii Crimson Fans, will pop up. And then you can putter about a little bit and read all the great work that she's doing over on her website. All right, that's it for today's gardening news. Now, if you'd like to check out any of my curated news articles that you hear on the show or any of the original blog posts that I write, you're in luck because I do share all of it with the listener community in the free Facebook group for the show, the Daily Gardener Community. So you never have to take notes or search for links. I try to make it easy for you. So the next time you're on Facebook, just search for the Daily Gardener Community and request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. Here's today's brevities. Today, Catholics honor Saint Phocas, the gardener who lived in Turkey during the 3rd century. A protector of persecuted Christians, Phocas grew crops in his garden to help feed the poor. Phocas is remembered for his hospitality and generosity, and his garden played an essential part in living both of those virtues. When Roman soldiers were sent to kill him, they could not find shelter for the night. Naturally, when Phocas encountered them, he not only offered them lodging, but made a meal for them from the bounty of his garden. Now, at some point during the meal, Phocas realized that they had come for him. While the soldiers slept that night, he went out to the garden, and he dug his own grave, and he prayed for the soldiers. In the morning, Phocas told the soldiers who he was, and the soldiers, who were in a state of shock, reluctantly killed him, and they buried him in the grave that Phocas had dug for himself. And although his story is tragic, we remember Phocas the gardener, a man who paved the way and showed us how to use our gardens to connect to others through generosity and hospitality. And today is the birthday of a woman who's remembered for one of the most popular hostas in American gardens, Frances Ropes Williams, who was born on this day in 1883. Frances had a shady garden in Winchester, Massachusetts. And what is the most used plant by shade gardeners? Hostas. That's right. Now, Frances had a special appreciation for hostas before they became widely used in American gardens. She was a graduate of MIT, and she was lucky enough to get the chance to work with Warren Manning, the famous Boston landscape architect. And she worked with Warren for a little over 2 years. Now, Frances stopped working to marry Stillman Williams. That was her husband. But sadly, he died after 20 years of marriage, leaving Frances with 4 young children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Now, Frances and her kids loved the outdoors. And when her kids were little, she made them one of the very first play sets in America. Now, when her children grew up, Frances found purpose in her garden, and she decided to zero in on hostas. They really had stolen her heart. She became known for hybridizing hostas, and she even wrote about them for various botanical magazines. So there's Frances in middle life, working with hostas, writing for botanical magazines, and then she decides to visit her daughter in college in New York. And this is how she discovered the hosta that would be named for her. After visiting her daughter, she decided to do what most of us would do: stop at a nursery on her way home. And so she did. She stopped at Bristol Nurseries in Connecticut. And there, in a row of Hosta Siboldiana, Frances spies a hosta that looks different. It has a yellow edge. And so she bought it, and she continued to grow it at home in her garden. Years later, Frances's hosta ended up in the hands of Professor George Robinson at Oxford. Now, when Frances had sent her plant to Professor Robinson, she did all the right things. She packaged it up carefully, and she labeled the plant, and she labeled it FRW, her initials for Frances Ropes Williams, and then the number 383. And the story goes that somehow the professor can't quite place the original label with that plant, but he knew that the hosta had come from Frances, and so he simply called it Frances Williams. And so he simply called the hosta the Frances Williams. And so that's the story behind the Frances Williams hosta. Today, as gardeners, we know the rest of the story. We know how popular the Frances Williams hosta became. And it's really crazy to think about the circumstances of its discovery. As for Frances, she continued to work with her beloved hostas, and she also spent a great deal of time helping the newly formed American Hosta Society. And I thought you would enjoy knowing that after Frances died in 1969, a hosta garden was planted in her memory at her alma mater, MIT. And today is the anniversary of the death of the Scottish-born botanist and author John Goldie. He died on this day in 1886, and he truly led an extraordinary life. John started out as an apprentice at the Glasgow Botanic Garden. As a young man, another botanist bumped him off of what was supposed to be his first plant exploration. But the botanical gods were smiling on him. The expedition was doomed, and had John gone on the expedition, he probably would have died, along with everyone else that did go, after contracting coast fever along the Congo River. 2 years later, after that fateful turn of events, William Hooker encouraged John to travel to North America. Now, this was an expedition that John successfully joined. He started in Montreal, and he made his way down the Hudson River to New York. He wrote that he carried as many botanical specimens as his back could carry. By June 25th, 1819, John was in Toronto, and when he reached the east side of the Rouge River, he wrote in his journal of the wildflowers, and especially the penstemon hirsutus that was growing on the east slope of the riverbank. John was astounded by the beauty and of seeing so much penstemon in, quote, such a quantity of which I never expected to see in one place. During John's incredible walking tour of Canada, he discovered a yellow variety of pitcher plant, as well as a rare orchid named Calypso bulbosa. He also encountered the prairie buttercup. In fact, John Goldie was the first person to describe the prairie buttercup. The name for the buttercup family, Ranunculaceae, is from the Latin term ranunculus, which means little frog. And this name was first bestowed on the plant family by the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. The name ranunculus, or little frog, is in reference to these mostly aquatic plants, and they tend to grow in areas where you'll find frogs in natural frog habitat. After his North American tour, John returned to the Glasgow Botanic Gardens, and for 5 years he trained an eager young apprentice and fellow Scot, David Douglas. And poignantly, when Douglas met an early death, John planted a Douglas fir next to his house to remember his young friend. After John Goldie discovered the giant wood fern, Hooker called it Dryopteris goldiana in his honor. And that's how we came to know it by the common name Goldie's wood fern. And when I think of John Goldie, I think of a very hard-working botanist. In fact, John worked tirelessly, and he recorded a total of 14 plant species previously unknown to science. As for John's connection with North America, it became his destiny. In 1844, John ended up settling with his family in Ontario, a place he had especially enjoyed during his botanical expeditions. In Unearthed Words, here are some wonderful thoughts about simply being in the garden. This first one's from the Canadian author Lucy Maud Montgomery, from her book Anne's House of Dreams. I love my garden, and I love working in it. To potter with green growing things, watching each day to see the dear new sprouts come up, is like taking a hand in creation, I think. Just now, my garden is like faith, the substance of things hoped for. And here's a quote by the English journalist and poet Rudyard Kipling. Gardens are not made by singing, "Oh, how beautiful," and sitting in the shade. This next one's from the gardener and author Eleanor Perenne. It takes a while to grasp that not all failures are self-imposed, the result of ignorance, carelessness, or inexperience. It takes a while to grasp that a garden isn't a testing ground for character, and to stop asking, what did I do wrong? Maybe nothing. And here's an excerpt from a book called A Place at the Table, written by the author Susan Rebecca White. She keeps walking, so I keep following, making our way down a stone path that leads to a set of tiered gardens. It is magical back here. Garden after garden. The first filled with herbs like Mama grows. Rosemary and lavender and mint and sage. Beyond that is a rose garden. There must be 50 rose bushes in it, all with different colored blooms. We keep walking down to the third tier, where there are tended beds like Daddy's vegetable patch in our backyard. Look at this, Keisha says. She stands behind row upon row of little green plants with thick green leaves. She kneels beside one of them and pulls back a leaf. There are small red strawberries growing underneath. She picks one and hands it to me. I've never eaten a strawberry that tastes like this before. It's so rich, with juice like honey. It's nothing like the ones Mama buys at Kroger. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Mr. Owita's Guide to Gardening by Carol Wall. This book came out in 2015, and the subtitle is How I Learned the Unexpected Joy of a Green Thumb and an Open Heart. People magazine said, in this profoundly moving memoir, Owita teaches Wall how to find grace amid heartbreak and to accept that beauty exists because it is fleeting, as in her garden, as in life. Oprah.com said, with her children grown and out of the house, Carol Wall is obsessed, perhaps overly so, with ripping out her azaleas. That is until she meets a certain Giles Owita, a Kenyan gardener, supermarket bagger, general life philosopher, and perhaps one of the most refined and gracious characters to ever hit the page, except that he's real. This book is 320 pages of gardening goodness, growing both plants and a lovely friendship. You can get a copy of Mr. Owita's Guide to Gardening by Carol Wall and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $20. And finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. Well, I don't know about you, but since we are in full-on pesto making mode around here, I wanted to share a recipe that I discovered called radish, salmon, and radish green salsa verde toasts by Amy Scattergood. Now, to make the radish green salsa verde, all you need to do is grab your food processor or blender and put in 2 cups of radish greens, 1 cup of cilantro, a half a cup of extra virgin olive oil, 3 garlic cloves, and then some salt, some zest and juice from 1 lemon, and 1 orange. Then you're going to blend that together until smooth, and you'll have about 2 cups of your salsa, your radish green salsa. Now, to put this all together, what you're going to do is get your toasted bread slices, and you're going to spread on cream fresh. So you need about 4 ounces of cream fresh for this recipe. After that, you'll top it with the salmon, and then some very thinly sliced radishes. Now, at this point, you're going to spoon over the top your beautiful radish green salsa. And that's it. A very impressive and tasty little appetizer or lunch. Radish, salmon, and radish green salsa verde. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Wyoming, Minnesota with the help of Paige Mance, Brooke Bierbaum, Kiana Rayleigh, Maddie Doyle, Natalie Decker, and Eric Begay. You can find The Daily Gardener on all your favorite social media. You can follow the show on Instagram, and listeners always have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. All the stories and books that are featured on the show can be found over at thedailygardener.org, thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. Last but not least, you can share your own gardener greetings on the show by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.